Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Nick Ravelis, the Director of Education and Community Engagement for San Diego Opera. You can call me Dr. Nick. You're coming to see the opera Nixon in China, and I'm sure you have all sorts of questions. You very likely think that opera deals only with things that happened, 100, 200, 300 years ago, or that opera only deals with fiction and fictitious characters, or mythology or ancient history. In other words, you may think that opera has very little to do with life as we live it here in 21st century America. Well, there certainly are operas like that. In fact, this season we're doing two other operas, La Bohème and Don Giovanni, that are entirely fiction and whose stories take place anywhere from a century to 3 centuries ago. But the opera Nixon in China is a completely different type of opera. It deals with real events, important world events that had far-reaching political consequences and that only happened about 40 years ago. Richard Milhous Nixon was the 37th President of the United States, and he was a controversial figure to say the least. In 1972, he was at the end of his first term, trying to figure out how to end the Vietnam War, along with his National Security Advisor and later Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. The war was extremely divisive for the country, polarizing, in fact, with half the country against it, the other half wanting it to run its course because it was presented to us as a fight against the encroachment of communism in Southeast Asia. With all of this controversy, he was facing re-election, and he was up against a tough Democratic opponent. He needed to do something dramatic, something tremendously positive, even world-shaking, in order to regain the popularity he'd lost in waging the war in Vietnam. He worked closely through Kissinger to plan the perfect event, a presidential trip to China that would show the world that the United States was interested in a peaceful and mutually beneficial relationship with a communist nation, a nation that had at the time 1 billion citizens. Now, why was this considered a radical and extremely important move? Because China had pretty much been cut off from the West ever since its takeover by the communist regime of the dictator Mao Zedong in the late 1940s. Mao believed in a very strict interpretation of communism, with a strong and often brutal central government, and the people sharing equally in the burden as well as the generosity of the state. With its ancient history of being ruled by a long line of emperors, treated like gods by the people, Mao felt that communism was the only answer for ruling such a large, impoverished country. For many reasons, this alienated the West, especially the United States, and China was left alone, isolated from the rest of the world except for its communist neighbor, Soviet Russia. For Richard Nixon, a Republican and strong anti-communist, to declare that he was going to lead a presidential visit to China where he would actually meet Mao Zedong, along with Zhou Enlai, the Chinese foreign minister, and do things like tour the Great Wall, have dinner with Chinese diplomats and officials, hammer out some kind of agreement between the two countries. Well, this was huge. It was a gigantic announcement, and it really had the country buzzing. The trip itself occurred in February 1972, and it was a gigantic success, probably putting Nixon well into positive territory when it came to the election in November. When the creators of the opera Nixon in China, director Peter Sellers, composer John Adams, and librettist Alice Goodman, when they started thinking about this historic event, they kept seeing the importance of the idea of contrast, East and West, Mao and Nixon, Kissinger and Zhou Enlai, American suits opposed to military uniforms, rich versus poor, violence versus peace. They felt that a wonderful musical theatrical piece could be created out of a study between these striking contrasts, and that's exactly what we should watch and listen for in the opera. It begins with the Chinese people singing phrases about life as it should be lived from the Little Red Book of Mao Zedong, a collection of his sayings and beliefs about communism. The Chinese people, in fact, could be considered the most important character in the opera. They observe everything and comment on the action of the story as it unfolds on the stage. When Nixon arrives with his entourage, including his wife Pat and advisor Kissinger, we see the contrast immediately. The Westerners in their two-piece suits and ties, the Chinese in their drab military garb, all looking alike. The opera continues as a kind of fantasy as the characters reenact many of the things that actually happened on that historic trip, like the many dinners, the trips to the countryside, the secretive visit between the president and Mao, and a performance at the Peking Opera, with the characters commenting and interacting with words and in ways that did not happen. This is a kind of dramatic device to help put the China visit in context and to help us, 40 years later, understand its deeper meanings. At the end of the opera, we see all the major characters, the president and his wife, Mao Zedong and his wife, Madame Mao, Zhou Enlai, all in their respective bedrooms at the end of the visit, the night before Nixon is to fly back to the U.S. They all reflect on what's happened, on what they've accomplished, if anything. This scene helps all of us put that history in perspective. What does Nixon's trip to China have to do with life as we know it today, in 2015? Did China really open up to the West? Did we gain influence on the Chinese government or the Chinese people? Have attitudes changed? And what about the balance of power? In 1972, we were certainly the most important country on earth. 40 years later, are we still? And what influence does China now have on some of the most significant issues of our day? The foreign minister Zhou Enlai has the final word in the opera, including the question, how much of what we did was good? So I want to talk about the music of this wonderful opera, Nixon and China, but first, a bit of a music history lesson. Classical music styles were all over the map in the 20th century, and things actually had gotten very complicated by about 1960. In fact, the musical language used by classical composers at that time was very abstract, difficult for audiences to connect with, sometimes even making audiences feel like they were left out. Now, this has happened a number of times in the history of music, and in fact in all the arts, where the arts have gotten too complicated, dense, or thick in texture, and artists made an effort to try to simplify things. That's exactly what happened in the 1960s with a musical style called minimalism. Minimalist composers tried to strip music back down to its basics, make things simpler in a way, and more approachable for audiences. They did this by using certain techniques, the most obvious one being repetition, simply repeating a musical idea over and over again, but with occasional changes or variations in the pattern. Let me give you an example. At the very beginning of the opera, a scale is repeated 30 times by the stringed instruments in the orchestra. Now, you know what a scale is, right? Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. But here's the scale that the composer John Adams uses at the beginning of this opera. Sounds just a little bit different, doesn't it? Well, this scale, as I said, repeats 30 times, and that sounds like it might be kind of boring. But around the repetition of that scale, other things happen in the music that are rather surprising. There are these other little events, little comments from other instruments in the orchestra. They kind of decorate that repeated scale so that after a few moments, you don't even notice that the scale is being repeated 30 times. It doesn't matter. The ear begins to focus on something else. Listen. Interesting, isn't it? But I want you to actually hear what it sounds like played by the orchestra. Here are those 30 repetitions of that scale as we hear it at the very beginning of the opera in an actual recording with the orchestra.
kind of hypnotic, isn't it? That technique of simple repetition really draws you in, but when things change in the pattern that the composer's set up, your ear notices it immediately. What's really interesting is that this simple idea of repetition doesn't just happen in the music, it also happens in the text, in the words of the opera. The first time President Nixon is on stage, after he's descended the steps of the presidential airplane, he sings an aria. The first word of the aria is news, and his words are all about the news that this great historic event is going to generate throughout the entire world. The word news is repeated 12 times, and then other parts of the sentence are repeated as well. The whole sentence is this: news has a kind of mystery. But the phrases has a and kind of mystery are both repeated in very strange, rhythmic, jazzy, and wonderful ways. Listen to this.
News. 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 News has a kind of mystery. Has a kind of mystery.
So the sentence, news has a kind of mystery, becomes something completely new, different, rhythmic, and quirky. What does it tell us about the character of Nixon? Well, I can only tell you what it tells me, and that is that he's excited to be the first president on Chinese soil, ready for history to change. It tells me that the character Nixon is a little quirky. It tells me that he's on the edge of his seat wondering what's going to happen next. And that's how we feel out in the audience. What's going to happen next? How will the composer John Adams treat the next character we meet on stage, and the next character, and the next? You know what? You're in for a really wild ride.
Nixon and China is a challenging opera by a living American composer and gives us a different idea of what opera can be about. Take a look at your morning news online or in the newspaper. There are lots of stories out there in the news every day, and any one of them could be a subject for opera. Think about it, and I'll see you at the opera.